Newscast from the BBC.
Chris Mason is here. Hello, Chris.
Hello from Norton Keynes in the West Midlands, sort of roughly between Cannock and Lichfield.
Norton Keynes.
Yeah, if you are a aficionado of the M6, it might be a name that rings a bell because there is a service station on the M6 toll, the bit that you have to pay extra for, called Norton Keynes, which I was familiar with, but I wasn't familiar with the place itself. In fact, I didn't even know there was a place itself beyond the service station, but there is, and that's where we are. And I've actually got pins and needles in my backside. We've just got out of our little car where there were three of us sitting on the back seat, and I was sitting in the middle seat. And you know, like the middle seat's kind of slightly raised.
Yeah.
And a long stint in that particular position is not good for the posterior, I've discovered. Anyway, I'm now sat on a wall outside a community centre and blood is returning to all necessary parts.
Chris, you're always doing the decent thing by other people, whether it's taking the middle seat, which no one likes doing, or I noticed on your piece on the 10 o'clock news, along with loads of users of social media, carrying the tripod.
Well, you know, I think we've all got to do our fair share of looking about, haven't we? You know, and I quite like the middle seat, so I didn't regard that as a massive imposition. Although about an hour
You
and a
like
half
the middle?
in,
No one likes the middle seat.
I quite like it. You get a good view straight out the front window.
True.
I quite like that. And
I
and
just
sort
don't
of all
trust those little
conversations
seat belts.
Well, no, it was a proper seatbelt. It was as opposed to one just round my lap. But also, you're sort of at the centre of all the conversations because the conversations are all happening around you. So I quite like that. Although it probably didn't help with my progress with my piece for the BBC website. But hey, I'll get to that later.
Whereas I like to have a snooze in the back seat, so that's why I don't like the middle seat. Also, I was going to say your tripod carrying technique. You know, it's much better to like put it on your shoulder because then you don't sort of waggle it around in front of everyone.
That particular, seeing as you're asking about the tripod that I was filmed carrying across Stoke-on-Trent railway station, that particular tripod, I'm conscious this is a rather niche conversation, but that particular tripod had neither a shoulder strap nor a plastic handle. So I had to grapple with it like some sort of caged animal that wasn't keen on being moved on. So not only are they quite heavy, they're quite cumbersome, and then the legs come flapping out if you don't know how to put them away properly and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's all part of the glamour of television.
And I should say they are a very important part of television journalism because much as people might like that kind of rough and tumble stuff, when you're seeing an interview with Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer or any other person, you kind of want it to be straight rather than wobbly. And so it can be a faff putting the tripod up, and it's definitely a faff carrying it, but it pays dividends.
Yeah, you don't notice when they're there, you do notice when they're not.
Anyway, what will we notice on today's episode of Newscast? You'll find out very soon.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it is Chris sitting on a garden wall in a community centre in Norton Keynes.
And as the blood rapidly returns to Chris Mason's buttocks, the buttocks of some of our fellow BBC News colleagues will be being planted in the Newscast sofa in a little bit because we're going to talk about some policy areas because we've been focusing quite a lot on politics and electioneering. Now, Chris, as we enter the final furlong, what is your strategy for the last few hours?
Charge around with the two people who want to be our Prime Minister by the weekend is basically it. So yesterday I was charging around with Rishi Sunak, and we went to the aforementioned Stoke-on-Trent, and then we ended up in Nuneaton in Warwickshire, where the Prime Minister was having a go at a bit of cricket. And then today we've been following Keir Starmer around. So here we are in Norton Keynes in the West Midlands. The day started in Hucknall in Nottinghamshire in the East Midlands. And what we're getting to now are two things that we've seen in the kind of arc of this campaign from the beginning and then all the way through, which is that you've seen the two main leaders aspiring to be Prime Minister return to their main theme. So Keir Starmer talking about change and Rishi Sunak talking about the dangers of a big Labour win and the dangers, as he sees it, of the tax burden spiralling higher under Labour, etc., etc. And then you've also seen Rishi Sunak campaigning in seats that were held by the Conservatives in the last Parliament, and some seats, frankly, that have been held by the Conservatives in pretty much every Parliament that you can possibly think of, very safe Conservative seats like Hinckley in Leicestershire, like Witney in Oxfordshire, David Cameron's former seat, and Keir Starmer fighting in seats that have been Conservative held, as you'd expect any leader of the opposition to do, but also ones that have been held often pretty comfortably by the Conservatives. So he was in Sherwood Forest this morning. He's coming to Cannock Chase this afternoon, and all of the candidates loiter on the BBC website for all of these constituencies.
It's interesting, the Rishi Sunak's message about, do you want to wake up on the 5th of July and there'd be a massive, massive Labour majority? And I'm just thinking back to a conversation we had with Laura a few weeks ago when that concept was first raised by the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. And I can't remember if it was you or Laura saying that, actually, the plan was to deploy that message much later in the campaign to kind of scare people to motivate Conservative voters to come out. It's interesting that having said it every day for 2.5 weeks now, it just doesn't seem as scary. You can see it would have had maybe more attention-grabbing shock value if it had been deployed in the last few days.
Yeah, perhaps so. Yeah, although, with the growing proportion in recent elections of people voting by post if they're able to, I think there's been awareness for the last couple of weeks that, perhaps up to a fifth of the electorate are voting or have been voting already. And I think actually coming into this morning, I was struck that you had this kind of narrative within the campaign of the Conservatives talking about the dangers, as they see it, of a Labour supermajority. And Keir Starmer, in an interview with The Times, leaning into what he sees as the value of a big majority to be able to do big stuff, potentially controversial stuff, not least making planning and development much easier, which obviously comes with those who will criticise it, making that easier if he gets, I think, what he called a sizeable mandate, which in anyone else's language is a big majority. But it's always worth thinking, isn't it? I was struck listening to Sir Craig Oliver, the former BBC editor and former Downing Street advisor to David Cameron on Newsnight last night, saying, there can still be a difference between the big narratives of the campaign and where the conversation might be at 10:10 on Thursday night when we get the exit poll, or maybe there won't be a difference. But the narrative right now shapes the conversation around which people are mulling over how they might vote. So it matters irrespective of where we end up.
It's interesting, that interview that Keir Starmer gave to the Times newspaper, which was published on Tuesday morning. And the bit that caught my eye is him talking about his children and the concept of moving into number 10, something he's talked about before, but he was talking about it like much more of a done deal. He sort of allowed himself to be picturing himself and his family in number 10, which I thought was interesting because that's not his natural caution that he's displayed in the previous weeks.
So I've been talking to Keir Starmer today, and I was really struck by, and put yourself in his shoes, it's really difficult how you do this publicly a couple of days out from an election. On the one hand, you have to look like someone who has given obvious and clear thought to what you would do in government, both on a practical level as far as family is concerned, but then on a governing level in terms of what you would seek to do, without at any time looking like you're sounding in any way that you formulate your sentences like you assume that it's a racing certainty that it's definitely going to happen, because that just sounds kind of complacent and sort of indifferent to the views of millions who are yet to cast.
They call it measuring the
single
curtains, don't they?
Vote.
In Westminster.
Yeah, exactly.
Parliaments.
And I could see in Keir Starmer's answers to me that precise dilemma. I was asking about the shape of a cabinet were he to win. I wasn't assuming he would win. I was just asking what it would look like if he were to win. Instantly he pushed back to that idea of saying, no, we must not be complacent, even though it seemed to me it's perfectly reasonable that newscasters ought to have an idea as they weigh up how to vote, what a Labour government, not just the top, not just the leader, but what a Labour government in its senior personnel might actually look like. It seems a perfectly reasonable question to ask, but he was aware of what he saw of the danger of entertaining that question because it might look complacent, even though sure as heck he must have a pretty good idea of what that top team is going to look like. And by the way, I suspect it'd look pretty similar to the current lineup of the shadow cabinet, but perhaps with a few kinks and tweaks here and there to reflect particular things he might have concluded and or the prospect of one or two maybe not getting back to Parliament.
Well, yeah, because the rumour mill at Westminster, well, there's nobody at Westminster, but in the social media around of people who are normally at Westminster is kind of going into overdrive about certain members of the shadow cabinet not making it into the actual cabinet if there is a Labour government. come Friday. And I just suspect that's in the absence because political journalists have got used to all the messages, and this last few days is about just ramming home the messages. So they're kind of just filling the airtime with something else.
Yeah, and to be clear, the two sort of things that hover in the air. One is Thangam Debonair, who faces a real battle with the Greens in a seat in Bristol. In other words, does she, as a current member of the Shadow Cabinet, win or not? Again, full list of candidates for Bristol Central on the BBC website. And then the other question that's hovered for a while is about David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and whether or not he will be kept on, which Keir Starmer has not been explicitly clear in saying yes to, and he wasn't explicitly clear to me either, although he did frame the whole thing as being much more vague. But he has said for months that Rachel Reeves would be the Chancellor in a Labour government, so there's a bit of inconsistency there. But as you say, Adam, that the point is, from their perspective at this stage, you just hammer the big messages and give the broad impression, if you're in Keir Starmer's position, or you hope to give the broad impression of being ready to seize the reins of power if they come your way.
Key thing at this stage is to just get the leaders off the script that everyone could recite themselves by heart now. I know you did that in a very clever way by referring to the football. Let's hear what the two men said. This is you asking Rishi Sunak about Jude Bellingham's last-minute saviour kick on Sunday.
So is there a Rishi Sunak equivalent of the Jude Bellingham overhead kick that we're going to see in the next 48, 72 hours to radically change what looks like the scoreline could be?
Mine is probably more a kind of flashy, cover drive or off drive or something instead. But there we go. Look, it is not over till it's over.
Literally no idea what that means, but I'm sure it will mean something to the football fans he's trying to appeal to there. And here is what Keir Starmer said when you asked him about comparisons with Gareth Southgate.
You must share a sort of sense of solidarity with Gareth Southgate, that doing a job where 1,000,001 other people think they could do a better job than you.
Yeah, everybody in the stands and watching the television has got a better idea how Gareth Southgate should do his job, and there are some similarities. I've got no end of advice. I've had it for 4.5 years, and no doubt I'll be getting a lot more.
What's your take on how they answered those questions?
I thought, just a tiny bit of revealingness at the very end of that answer from Keir Starmer. No doubt I'll be getting a lot more. Would he get a lot more if he didn't win? I mean, maybe he would, I suppose, because loads of people would say, oh, you would have won if you'd done A, B, C and D. But it kind of nodded to the prospect that he might soon be Prime Minister. I'd also asked Keir Starmer about Bukayo Saka, the England player who had a little stint at left back as opposed to playing on the right wing, kind of the opposite end of the pitch. And Keir Starmer is a proper football fan. His sort of eyes light up when you ask him about football because he knows his stuff and he's interested and passionate about it. Whereas, as you heard with Rishi Sunak, yes, he is a football fan, supports Southampton, but cricket's his real thing. So he ended up turning that line about the football into a line about a shot that a batsman would play at cricket. It's one of those things that you either know a lot about or absolutely nothing about, as I discovered when I sort of used that line in our reporting of it last night. But yeah, you're right, Adam. It's trying to find, let's be honest, if you were either of those two men in these last couple of days, all you want to do is get your vote out and hammer home your main messages. And to heck with what people like me ask, you just sort of give the same answers come what may. And, that's kind of rational from their perspective. So I'm constantly trying to find, it's a bit easier with Keir Starmer when you can sort of tease away potentially at a few things that, a Labour government would confront, whereas you kind of know what the answer from Rishi Sunak would be because they've been confronting those issues in office themselves. But yeah, I'm always constantly trying to find, is there something that can bring out a bit more of a human answer or something where they're just, as you say, off script a bit? And actually, the football this week, because it's one of those things that, 17 point something million people at peak were watching that football the other night. Even folk who most of the time don't give football much attention will probably be aware of Jude Bellingham and an overhead kick. And so it's one of those things where you can just hope that they're up for just sort of talking off script, off piste a bit. There's another sporting reference. Rather than talking about change and talking about tax and all the usual gubbins.
off-piste, at least a sport I finally recognise. Also, I noticed Rishi Sunak's famous work ethic is slightly getting the better of him, because he is obviously a bit tired, because he said in his interview with you yesterday, misspeaking, "Oh, we haven't achieved anything as a government," which I saw a few people making light of.
And you know what? Yes, yes, I saw David Mitchell on social media picked up on that. I have to be honest, and maybe this is also the exhaustion of us lot as a reporter pack. So none of us in that room recording that interview, either the team I work with nor the Prime Minister's team, noticed that, and neither did we notice it when we watched the interview back. Some colleagues did, and then plenty of other people did on social media. So you kind of knew what he intended to say, and I'd heard it so many times. I kind of heard it as it meant to come out rather than as it did come out. So that was a little bit teased away at, wasn't it? But I mean, I think the exhaustion thing, anyone who denies the exhaustion thing at this stage of the election campaign is just not being truthful. It's great fun to be involved in. It's an incredible thing to report on. But there's an odd splash of tiredness around, let's be frank.
It's just quite funny seeing the blatant things that people are doing in the last few days, like Steve Reid, the Shadow Environment Secretary, on the Labour battle bus, handing out these pillows with pictures of Rishi Sunak on them, saying, "Don't wake up to Rishi Sunak on the 5th of July." And then Rishi Sunak blatantly trying to bribe all the travelling journalists with free McDonald's breakfasts. It's all just a bit obvious.
Yes, there is all of that. I've noticed that the last couple of days, both Labour and the Conservatives have been sort of leaning into this sort of imagery about who you wake up next to. There's been quite a lot of stuff about pillows and alarm clocks going off and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of quite, I don't know, evocative imagery. But then, for those who decide that sleeping between midnight and 6 a.m. is a sensible thing to do, then there is that sense, isn't there, that you wake up on Friday morning, even if you've caught the exit poll on Thursday night, you wake up on Friday morning and the political landscape is remoulded, either significantly or otherwise, for the best part of the next 5 years. And that's kind of quite a thing.
What are your plans for Wednesday, last day?
So tomorrow, we're not quite sure yet, is the honest truth. Here we are in sort of Norton Keynes, wondering which compass bearing might next attract us. It depends. Can we get to some of the main leaders tomorrow? Because if we get to any of them, we've kind of got to get to quite a few of them. Gets quite tricky because they all start zipping around at an even greater pace. Basically, tomorrow my job is to pull the whole thing together to make sure that newscasters and other sort of BBC News viewers, listeners and readers get a full sense of what all of the parties are kind of up to. And then I guess kind of take stock really on where the last 6 weeks have left us, what's changed and what hasn't. So what hasn't changed? Well, the opinion polls haven't really changed for Labour and the Conservatives. What has changed? Well, Nigel Farage entered the stage. They're my sort of two top line kind of thoughts. And we kind of, it would seem, don't we, stand on the brink of a kind of landmark election. But where actually whether it is or not will be determined by millions of individual decisions that, even if they've been made, haven't been committed to yet. And that's the jeopardy of the next couple of days.
Newscast from the BBC.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, but we recorded some bonus material that you can hear in the podcast version, which is available on BBC Sounds. And we will be back here on BBC News live at 6:30 on Wednesday evening to cover all the thrills and spills of the final day of campaigning in the UK general election 2024. Join us then live. What could possibly go wrong? Bye.